Welcome to the HERHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk, where we empower women and girls to take charge of their health and well-being. Join us as we shine a spotlight on issues affecting women and girls' health and explore ways to create positive change. Get ready to be inspired and empowered as we discuss health, advocacy, and empowerment for women and girls at risk. Please be advised that this podcast may cover sensitive topics such as gendered violence. We understand that these discussions can be difficult to listen to. If you feel uncomfortable or need support, we encourage you to prioritize your well-being. Consider exploring our other podcasts if these topics are triggering for you. Resources can be found in the description.
Oh yeah, welcome back everyone to the HERHealth Podcast, where we highlight voices, research, and ideas driving change in health and social systems for women, girls, and gender diverse people affected by violence and adversity. I'm your host, Alexandria Lazochek today, and this episode is going to be adapted from the AVA webinar series, Suing for Silence, Sexual Violence, and Defamation Law in Canada, featuring Dr. Mandi Gray from Trent University. Dr. Gray's groundbreaking book, Suing for Silence, examines how abusive men can weaponize defamation lawsuits to silence survivors and their supports. And in Canada, even formal reports to police or universities are not protected from such lawsuits, making the act of coming forward even riskier or even scarier. And drawing from a critical feminist perspective, Dr. Gray sheds light on the institutional failures that enabled the tactic and warns of the chilling effect it could have on sexual violence disclosure. So diving into Dr. Gray is an assistant professor in the Sociology department at Trent University. She has also worked with women and girls involved in the legal system since 2008 and is also the primary subject and impact producer of the 2018 documentary Slut or Not: The Diary of a Rape Trial. Her work has been featured in the Toronto Star, CBC, Globe and Mail, and Toronto Life. Thank you so much, Dr. Gray, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Amazing. We'll dive in. So, I'm really interested about what inspired you to write Suing for Silence. And was there a particular case or experience that made you realize that this was a pressing issue that needed to be addressed?
Absolutely. I really began to notice after hearing disclosures from two different women that had been sued for reporting sexual harm. And that was really surprising to me because at that point I had been working in the, with gender-based violence sector for nearly a decade. And I was unaware that it was even possible to be sued in defamation for making a formal report, whether it be to the workplace or police. I always assumed that would be, off limits. And I asked civil litigator Joanna Birnbaum, who has really a lot of experience representing survivors of sexual violence, if she was aware of such lawsuits. And she shared with me that she was representing three different women, all of whom had been sued for reporting sexual harm. This was predated the Me Too movement. And then the Me Too movement happened, and there were a whole slew of new defamation lawsuits being reported. And that's when I began doing the interviews. And I wasn't really sure how many people would respond to participate in my research study. It's really difficult to assess the scope in which these defamation lawsuits are being filed. There's no centralized database where I can even tell you how often defamation lawsuits are being initiated more generally in Canada. So I was really uncertain how many people would even respond to my participation recruitment. And unfortunately, I had enough participants to write an entire book about the issue. Not to suggest that this is necessarily a new tactic. I did find some lawsuits dating back to the early 80s when sexual harassment in the workplace had just become an issue that was being discussed more generally. So it has been growing though in its occurrence and frequency as a result of the Me Too movement and the backlash to that movement.
Hmm. Thank you so much for diving in about what inspired you, the particular cases, and it's kind of shocking as well diving into this field as well, like that defamation could occur after a survivor kind of goes into the legal system. So thank you for kind of shedding light on this harsh reality. You argue that failures by police and courts can leave survivors vulnerable to these lawsuits. And can you share how these institutional gaps create additional harm and barriers to reporting?
Yeah, the institutional gaps are widely documented in feminist literature in terms of unfounding by police, so not taking the reports to police seriously. The all the failures of campus to respond to allegations and disclosures of sexual violence on campus. All of that's been pretty widely documented in the literature and in the media, especially within the last decade or so. But I think what's been missing from that narrative is how these failures then are misconstrued as these individual women as being liars, as not being truthful, as evidence that they are not to be believed. When in fact it's these larger institutional failures to take sexual violence and reports of sexual violence seriously. But on the other hand, what I've also seen in my research is that instances where the institution responds as they should. So, for example, a woman makes a report to her college that her professor sexually harassed her. The college investigates. They do what we would think would be the right thing. They fire the faculty member. And then he sues the woman for the report to the police, or not to the police, sorry, the college, because he lost his job. So again, even when the institutions do the so-called right thing, it's still, in these cases of the defamation lawsuits, becomes the sole responsibility of these women to justify their reports and the actions that these institutions took. And it's not like the college is jumping to support her and help pay her legal fees. It's really these individual women have to defend themselves and make arguments in court on their behalf, without necessarily having any financial support from the institutions that failed them.
Yeah, just a lot of trickle down effects of just poor implications of just by police and then it trickles down and it'll impact the individual in a negative way. So yeah, harsh reality for sure. And then I'm very curious about one of your warnings is that these lawsuits risk silencing public discourse about sexual violence. And what might this disappearance kind of look like in practice? And what are the broader implications for advocacy and prevention?
Absolutely. When I first wrote the book, my argument was a little softer. I said that it was going to push discourse around sexual violence and disclosures back into the private sphere. And one of the reviewers said to me, no, I think it's going to do more than that, because what we're seeing is private emails to family members are being cited in litigation, for example. So it's not even necessarily pushing it into private sphere, it's keeping people silent out of fear of possible repercussions, and fear. And especially, as I mentioned in the webinar, men who have considerable financial resources, access to lawyers, so people with cultural capital. I've talked to a lot of women who were sued by men who had friends who worked as lawyers, who had no problem sending off a notice of claim or sending a cease and desist letter, for example. So it really can protect men in positions of privilege and power and really keep people silent. In terms of media reporting, there's much more concerns around defamation lawsuits that may deter from writing about certain cases or reporting certain details of the case. And even I write in the book, I omitted several details from the book out of my own fear of being sued in defamation, just because of how costly it is, and how few, there's nobody that's going to be defending me if I get sued for this book, in terms of like putting up money for the costs associated with and the professional repercussions of being sued for defamation, because it insinuates that what you are saying is not true, and that you are fabricating what you are saying.
Thank you so much for kind of situating the conversation in a place of talking about power and privilege and how those can negatively impact survivors of sexual violence and can men with power can take advantage of the privilege that they hold going forward. So I really appreciate that we situated that in this conversation today. Yeah, your work also highlights that supporters, not just survivors, can be targeted as well when it comes to these matters. So I'm curious, how has this affected the willingness of friends, family, or advocates to come forward in solidarity?
In the book, I use the term silence breaker because one of the surprises that I guess came through in the recruitment was that it wasn't just survivors who were being sued in defamation. It was also people who were support people. It was advocates who wrote an op-ed advocating for better investigations into doctors who sexually abuse their patients, for example. So it was far broader than just the survivors. And it also contributes to the silencing effect that I had just talked about, right? Because if you cast a wide net and sue a whole bunch of people, it's going to cause concern. Nobody wants to be added to the litigation. Um, it'll flag that person as litigious, casts doubt on the claims being made. So it is possible, and I have a whole chapter dedicated to campus sexual assault because another kind of surprising finding from the interviews was the number of faculty who I interviewed who were sued or threatened with a lawsuit because they supported their students who were reporting another faculty member for sexual harassment or sexual violence. So it's also something to consider when engaging in advocacy work in terms of what allegations are being repeated, how they're being repeated, the types of things that are put in emails, because that can all be subjected to litigation potentially in a defamation suit. So it is potential to cast a really wide net. And I have seen that in several lawsuits where it was the perpetrator sues everybody, and it really works to isolate the individual who disclosed or reported, because oftentimes what the lawyers will tell you is stop talking, don't talk to one another, and can be very isolating for everybody named on the lawsuit to no longer have that support system.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can put people in a really dangerous place as well. So I'm very curious with that, with like legal reforms or policy change, what kind of legal reforms or policy changes could help protect survivors as you mentioned, silence breakers or allies from retaliatory lawsuits without really undermining legitimate defamation claims?
Absolutely. And it's not to say that I don't think people should actually edit that out. I'm going to. I think that there's a number of legal reforms that could be beneficial. I think first and foremost, and this would be a relatively simple change in legislation, would be to have the defense of what's called absolute privilege and have it explicitly cover reports to police, to prohibit defamation lawsuits from being initiated. And so I think that would help if we are to continue as a society to continue encouraging survivors to formally report to police is that if they are to report, they need to be confident that their report will not result in them being sued in defamation. And if there are concerns about false reporting, which while it doesn't happen often, it can potentially happen. However, there's other torts available to men who have legitimately been the subject to a false report, and that would be the tort of malicious prosecution. So there is a tort that could potentially protect people who have a case for false reporting. For defamation, I do think another is the anti-SLAPP legislation. There is legislation, and it stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. That's the more like not the formal legal name of the legislation, but that's kind of what everyone refers to it as. Ontario and BC have this legislation, and it's intended to give people who speak on matters of public interest a route to have the lawsuit dismissed before even having to file a defense. And so while this legislation is far from perfect, it is also very time consuming and can be very costly. There are a number of cases that have successfully used this legislation to have lawsuits against survivors who made formal reports be dismissed. Of course, the limitation being only Ontario and BC have this legislation. We haven't seen much protection from the courts in this legislation or any at all around social media disclosures or disclosing to like a large number of people. It's pretty confined to these formal reports, confidential reports within the workplace, for example. So there is potential for other provinces to adopt similar legislation. Again, noting that I sometimes hear from survivors saying, well, I posted this on social media because I know there's anti-SLAPP legislation here. However, it's too simplistic to just say that because the legislation exists, you can say whatever you want. That's really, the courts have actually been taking this pretty delicate in terms of the weighing of should this lawsuit be able to proceed. And oftentimes the courts have not seen any real value in social media reports or disclosures. And that's a whole other conversation to get into around the use of social media for feminist advocacy. But I'm just talking about how the courts have really interpreted it to date. So those are two, I think, really kind of key legal reforms that could better protect survivors. And I guess I didn't talk about this much, and it's not used that frequently, but it's not to say it's never used. There is also a criminal code defamation charge. So survivors can also potentially be criminally charged in defamation. Again, like I said, it's not used frequently in Canada, but it does exist in the criminal code, and places like the United Nations have actually argued that criminal defamation is limits engagement in a democratic society. There are a number of countries that do have defamation, and it only exists as a criminal code offense. So in certain countries, we are seeing women facing criminal charges for making reports to police under defamation as a criminal charge as opposed to civil, the way it is here. Used primarily in Canada, but not always. I have met women who have been criminally charged in Canada with defamation by police.
Mhm. I'll let you take a little sip of water, but thank you so much for diving into that. I truly appreciate it. And I'll probably pick your brain about some questions after the podcast.
If you want to cut that out, don't worry about keeping that in because it's a little confusing.
All good. Yeah. Well, I'll go over it again, so no worries. Yeah, diving back into it. So we live in really trying times right now, and it can be really hard to kind of see the hope in this line of work and research. So after researching and writing for Suing for Silence, what gives you hope for change?
That's a great question, and it's something that I sometimes find challenging because I really see things that give me a lack of hope in terms of institutional change, in terms of systems protecting people, and oftentimes even perpetuating further harm. With that being said, I think what really motivated me to keep going as I was both writing and promoting the book and continuing to do podcasts and webinars like this one was all the silence breakers that I interviewed, and I asked many of the allies and supporters, do you regret doing what you did, given the severe consequences of the litigation? And none of them regretted standing up for survivors, for challenging their institutions to better respond to sexual harm, despite experiencing really severe consequences like loss of jobs, loss of professional networks, like severe like mental health and health consequences that they attributed to the stress of the litigation against them. And that gave me hope and, kind of propels me to keep going, because even if these lawsuits are very damaging for a lot of reasons, in and of itself, it's not reason enough to stop doing the advocacy work that we're doing, to stop supporting survivors, to stop urging these institutions to do better. Is it a barrier? Absolutely. Just sometimes I want to just stop and not do this anymore because the consequences are really challenging on some days. But I think that was really inspiring to hear from those who held positions of privilege similar to myself, and really wanted to use that privilege in society to make it more equitable and better for future generations.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gray. It was lovely having this chat with you. Was there anything that you would like to speak more to or add anything that we may have missed today?
No, I really appreciate the conversation. And I think the only thing I would add is that I am working on a website for the Defamation Defense Hub, and it's going to be coming out in the fall. And it's going to be intended as a resource for people to learn more about defamation lawsuits and the leading case law in this area, to help both service providers and survivors just better understand the risks of making certain statements, and the different defenses available to them, and create a sort of hub of knowledge in this area that not a lot of people really know about. Even within law school, you're not really taught about defamation law. It might be like a part of one little course, but it's really not even something that lawyers are being trained in. And so it is a very niche area of law. But I hope to fill some of those knowledge gaps with our upcoming website that I'm working on in collaboration with a lawyer named Lil Kadu Shah, and has significant experience in both defamation and sexual assault law. So I'm really looking forward to launching that in the fall.
And we can't wait to hear more in the fall time. Thank you so much for joining us at Her Health.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us on the HERHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk. Remember, your health matters, and together we can make a difference. Until next time, remember to prioritize your health and well-being. For more resources and support on issues affecting girls, women, and gender-diverse people, visit our website at avatraining.ca. This is Dr. Nicole Letourneau. Thank you for listening.